And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Still Curtain podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Jaggi. Joining me, as always, is contributor for Still Curtain, Shayne Kubas. We've got a lot to talk about here. So much has happened since the last time we've been on this show. Just yesterday, the Steelers cut down their roster. They made their finishing touches to their initial 53, and we've already seen a big change to that. But they made 17 roster moves in the final hour and a half right before the deadline. So we're going to break down every position on the Steelers roster today. We're going to do a little dissecting there. Shayne and I will share our thoughts on each position. We're going to talk about the Desmond King signing that just happened this morning and what that means for the Steelers, the Kendrick Green, Kevin Dotson trades. So a lot to talk about today. Stay with us. And if you have any questions, we have the live chat open. Please pop them in the chat. We'd love to hear your Steelers roster questions. And so, Shayne, let's get into it with the trending Steelers news this week and the trending news just around the league. Let's start in general here. NFL roster cut downs. What were your biggest takeaways from maybe some other teams before we get into the Steelers?
Well, I think it's the first thing I'd want to talk about is actually not a cut or a roster decision necessarily, but a lack of one with the Jonathan Taylor situation.
I knew where you were going with that.
Yeah. So that situation stuff is something I was monitoring as, in the AFC, if it would have been to the Dolphins, who was the main competitor for his services, if they were to trade for him or if they were to trade him from the Colts. That deal not getting done and him getting left on the PUP list tells me that you assume the injury stuff is real, you hope, because if not, that's a serious, situation that the NFL's gonna have to look into.
But that's a boo-boo there.
Yeah, so I assume that might be part of it. I also think the Colts were never super seriously interested in trading him, honestly. I think they gave him the opportunity to go look for a deal, like they said, just to basically appease him and say, hey, go try it, but we're not going to accept anything above, or below market value, what we think. And I think the whole problem with it is we touched on it when the running backs were complaining before, and rightfully so, is Irsay and the Colts don't value him enough to pay him, but they do value him enough to not let him go for anything other than a really substantial package. And it kind of puts both sides in this tug of war of okay, we don't want to pay you, but we still value a ton to the offense and to the team, but we don't really want to show you that appreciation. Right? So it's just it's a bad situation. I assume just for his own sake, he's going to play when he can because he wants to build up his value, all that stuff. But just a rough situation. And then as far as cuts, I just want to talk about the Patriots, which I don't know at this point if they have a backup quarterback on the roster. I know that Bailey Zappi did clear waivers, so he is a free agent, so they could go and I guess get him back if they wanted to. But I don't know what that situation's about. It's just a lot of weird stuff. There's a couple weird things throughout the league that I was a little surprised by. But
the Zappi one was weird because I'm like, if there is a Mac Jones clone that can replicate what Jones does, it's Zappi. I mean, those guys are so similar. Yeah. And for them to cut their backup quarterbacks and leave kind of just empty right there, I'm like, I really don't understand what's going on. I honestly don't. And so that was an interesting decision. And then the Jonathan Taylor thing, it's like, these guys are asking, you're calling about Jalen Waddle. They're not in the same stratosphere in terms of value that that's the thing is that there was a little naive, I think, of them to think that they could get a package like that for a running back who's got quite a bit of mileage on him. Obviously, you know him from the Wisconsin days there and did a lot of running the football. And so it's just, I mean, all the evidence points to running backs are best on their first contract. Right. And you just didn't think that they would have much leverage to begin with. I mean, I don't know if we'll see another trade deal like the one that we saw the 49ers just make for McCaffrey. Like McCaffrey is special as a receiver as well. But even then it's like injury history and just all the things associated with that and paying them on top of everything else. I just don't know if that's going to happen anymore. Even with a player as good as Jonathan Taylor, I don't know. I'm thinking the Colts, maybe they should have just went with the best offer if you're going to sit him for the first 4 weeks and disgruntle him even further. And so just a kind of a debacle over there in Indianapolis. Let's talk about the Steelers. They made a pair of trades since Sunday, trading 2 offensive linemen who weren't going to play this year, barring multiple injuries. And so let's start with the Kevin Dotson trade. That one happened first on Sunday evening. Of course, the Steelers, they like to keep us media members on our heels here. And I can't enjoy a Sunday evening before the season with my family before something has to happen. So traded Kevin Dotson to the Rams. And for a pair of pick swaps. So the Steelers got LA's 4th this coming year in exchange for their 5th. They got the 5th round pick the following year in exchange for their 6th. This doesn't seem like a big deal, but I want to put this into perspective a little bit here, Shayne, for the people listening. I went back and looked at the 2023 draft listing, and there is a 77 gap spot between the start of the 4th round and the end of the 5th round. That's like 2 rounds essentially difference. I mean, even more so than that you're looking at. If we think that the Rams are going to be a bad football team, and I think that we do, I mean, they're not super talented, and you think that the Steelers are going to be good, this is a great trade for the Steelers because you potentially move up like 50 to 70 spots in the draft. Like, this is a huge deal because you could have been looking at like pick 125, pick 130. Now you're looking at pick maybe like 105-ish. So you're talking about something that big of a difference in the draft. That's a solid pick. That should be a good player for your football team. So I love that for a player who was not going to see the field unless Seumalo or Daniels went down. And then after that, Herbig would have probably had to go down for him to be able to get there. He was going to be the new Kendrick Green, if you will, this year, the guy that just didn't get a hat on game day, but was still on the roster. So what do you make of that trade?
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense for both teams. I think that Dotson is a capable guard. I'm not going to sit here and say that he's as good as I think we all hoped he'd be, but he's still a capable guard. He's a really good pass blocker overall. I think he can definitely help the Rams out from that perspective. And from the Steelers, again, you have the depth now. You don't need to keep this guy on the roster unless he's going to play. And if he's not going to get a hat, like you said, on game days, which again, very likely might not have in certain situations at least, getting extra draft capital or higher draft capital, I guess we should say, because you're just doing the pick swaps. It's worth it, right? I mean, you only spent a 5th round pick on the guy back in the day. Like, you don't have to get crazy value to just, offset it. And he played, started a lot of games for this team as a 5th round pick. He got more than the value out of his contract, and now you get a little bit more. I think it makes a ton of sense, like I said, for both sides though, because the Rams are in a rough spot. So getting a guard who can play, and I think he will play for them right away. I think he probably will get a starting job there sooner rather than later. It makes a lot of sense for both teams.
Yeah, and Dotson obviously was that the 4th rounder from Louisiana Lafayette back in 2020 draft.
Round,
and he started out, that's good. He started out his career pretty strong, I thought. I mean, we had hope for him. Eventually, though, you get to a point where you level out. I mean, he is a guy that turned 24 years old, I think, during his rookie season, if I recall. And so an older prospect to begin with. And even though he looks the part, like the massive barrel-chested, strong anchoring ability type of guy, just a lot of mental lapses over these past couple of years. And look, this isn't one of those hindsight things. I'm not going back on my thoughts on Dotson, like, oh, I love Dotson until the time he's traded. No, my opinion has not changed on Dotson. I thought that Dotson would be a guy that was buried on the depth chart this year because of the Herbig signing, especially because of the Seumalo signing. And we knew that he wasn't going to see the field unless you're probably looking at multiple injuries occurring for him to get that spot back with that starting unit. And so as long as that doesn't happen, Shayne, I think this turns out to be great. If the Steelers somehow get decimated, then yes, there is a world where you can be saying, I wish I had Kevin Dotson right now, because what you're going to have behind the backup to your backup is not going to be Kevin Dotson on most teams. So I do think that the Rams are getting a low-level starting guard, which is how I viewed Dotson these past couple of years. But the Steelers, I will gladly take the draft capital, even with the risk of, if we do run into multiple injuries, you're hoping it doesn't happen. Steelers were the healthiest offensive line in the NFL last year. But if that does happen, I mean, you're taking a gamble is what you're doing here. But I think it's one that's worthwhile. You're moving up pretty significantly in the draft. I think it's going to ultimately be about 60 spots-ish in the draft, which is a good chunk there. Let's talk about the Kendrick Green trade, one that was more surprising. Like, we all called the Dotson trade. We didn't know.
We expected that to,
Everybody in the media and their mother knew that Dotson, there was a good chance at least he was going to get traded. We were talking about that back at the NFL draft, and we didn't know that it would come just an hour and a half before the deadline, but it is what it is. It happened. And the Kendrick Green one, however, I don't know if anybody knew that he had trade value left. And I got to be honest, after seeing him get traded for this 6th rounder, I don't know if Houston watched the same film on Green that I was watching, because this guy just can't anchor. And you're in year 3 now, 3rd season, off season in a football program. You have to show the ability to hold up on a consistent basis. And he's just a guy that's going to end up getting the quarterback killed. I just don't have any hope for him, but good luck to Green on Houston.
So I think for me, first of all, like you said, Khan getting anything for him is great, right? Like, I didn't care if it was a conditional 7th, whatever. He wasn't going to make the roster, clearly. getting a 6th-round pick next year for him, or really into, I guess, 2025.
25.
It is, again, it's good for them to be able to do that. Now, the only thing I'll say with Green with the Texans is I think that if he's going to have a chance to carve out a backup role, it's going to be in a wide zone movement offense, one that he can get on the move. He's blocking on the move most of the time. They can help protect him inside as a center, or a guard, whichever one. It really doesn't matter too much in that type of scheme. It's going to at least make him, you have the possibility of sticking around a little bit, right? Like, I'm not going to say he's ever going to be a starter or anything like that, like he was in his rookie season, but I think at the very least he could carve out a career as a backup in that type of scheme where he was never going to be a scheme fit for us realistically. The pick at the time, even though I liked the athleticism, I liked what I saw from him, it was a weird fit, and it always kind of was, and it was going to be as long as Canada was here and we're running this type of offense. So, I hope Green can stick around for a long time. Obviously never want to see a guy lose his career or anything, but this is probably his last chance and probably the best chance he's going to get realistically.
Yeah. And going back to that draft, it still irks me, Shayne, because I'm like, I liked Quinn Miners a lot. I know he was a small school guy and completely unproven, but he was sitting there in round 3. I mean, he was as strong as a bull. He was awesome at the Senior Bowl. And even looking the 2 picks prior to that, like I was a huge Creed Humphrey supporter. Like I would have been, I had him 23rd overall on my draft board. I would have been content with Steelers taking him in the 1st round, and then they passed on him again. And obviously went to the Chiefs, and then Miners is sitting there, and you take kind of Kendrick Green out of the blue. And I know that I've got an opposite opinion on a lot of people on this. There's a lot in the Steelers media who think the Steelers did him wrong by moving him from guard to center, Shayne. I disagree with that. I think where they did him wrong was forever thinking he could move back to guard. They needed to leave him at center. And if he wasn't going to work at center, he wasn't going to work anywhere. I mean, you're talking about a guy that is 6'1" and 7/8, 300 pounds soaking wet. I mean, his size is in like the 1st percentile if you compare him to NFL guards. So having him go against defensive tackles head on, he just does not have the anchoring strength. It's what he showed these past couple of years. If he wasn't going to make it work at center, he wasn't going to make it work at all, unfortunately. And I think what's important to remember here too, Shayne, is this was not an Omar Khan pick or an Andy Weidel pick. This was a Kevin Colbert pick. And so they didn't have an attachment to this guy, but kudos to them for getting draft capital out of a guy that they weren't necessarily the ones making that call. And so I'm glad that it wasn't them that busted on this pick, because there's a lot of reason to be optimistic about this front office now with what they've done this past year.
But I will say, if you are someone who's saying the Steelers did him wrong, the only argument I'd hear for that is drafting him at all, given the scheme fit. That's, if you want to say that, I agree with that, honestly. But other than that, like, he was never going to be a guard. He just didn't have the size profile. It'd be different if he was, truly strong and like showed anchor and showed power, and like, because there's always exceptions to the rule, right? But
there are, for sure.
He just isn't the exception to the rule. So.
It would even be like Shayne taking like Tyler Linderbaum and trying to make him a guard when he is a center only type player. Like, it's, and I know that Green played guard at Illinois, but it just wasn't going to work.
You could
tell by the profile and the lack of like anchoring strength that he had that it just wasn't going to happen, and it didn't. So it is what it is. Steelers got a couple picks out of these 2 guys. Fans can be happy with that. At least gives us something to look forward to. And Shayne, I think that again, we've looked at the front office. When's the last time the Steelers have been forward thinking like they have over this past year? Like you trade away players to get picks. Like, this is the anti Kevin Colbert method, where before it's like, I'm trading a pick for Vance McDonald, I'm trading one for Nick Vannett and Avery Williamson, and I'm going out and getting these veteran players. I don't know if they're going to make a difference or not, but I'm going to get these guys for my mid-round picks. Steelers are going the opposite direction now, saying, I'm confident in the team we have, but I also want to set myself up for success in the future. And I love that mentality.
Yeah, I think especially for a team that is going to only get more expensive, because you have a lot of young offensive talent that's going to have to get paid eventually. Obviously Kenny's a long way away from getting paid, so that's going to be helpful. But at some point, I mean, the defense is already going to be expensive. It's going to get more expensive over time, I'm sure, especially if some of the guys are drafting hits. Like, you have to be able to avoid the type of situation the Rams are in right now, where they had to draft 15 rookies and keep most of them on the roster just to be able to field the team, right? So being able to supplement your roster with guys who you take in the 4th, 5th, 6th round, who, again, this team has shown in the past to be good at doing that, even before this front office that we have now is in place. But they need the picks, right? You can't just keep, throwing them away to whatever veteran that you want to add to the team, especially because now they're actually signing players in free agency, so they don't have to go trade for players once the season is getting close. So definitely glad to see that change so far.
Yeah, I am all here for the proactive approach. That's always kind of been my mentality. It's like, don't sacrifice your future unless you are like going all in and you know for sure you've got a chance to win a Super Bowl. So I like being able to ditch Chase Claypool for an early pick that ends up being Joey Porter Jr. And I think it's going to benefit the Steelers in the end. And so obviously the picks that the Steelers got for Dotson and Green are certainly not guaranteed to be better than those players. I mean, they spent higher draft capital originally on those guys, but you're getting something out of it. You can move around in the draft a little bit if you need to. And so I just like having that option, leaving that option open to, I'm okay with getting better in the future. I don't have to try to make everything about just here and just now. Let's talk about Desmond King here. The Steelers signed the veteran cornerback this morning from formerly of the Houston Texans, played the last 2 years in Houston, was really good in his early days on the Chargers. But I think it's been a while since we saw like that Pro Bowl-ish, all-pro caliber. Never made a Pro Bowl, but he did make an all-pro as a return man and cornerback in his second season. I thought his first 2 seasons were awesome. Was still a solid football player after that. 2021 hit a slump. According to Pro Football Reference, gave up like 725 yards and 5 touchdowns, 92 point something passer rating. And so definitely hit a little bit of a slump 2021. Comes back with a pretty solid season last year. I see some people likening this to like, oh, this is the Steelers are getting Joe Hayden again, coming in at 28 years old, a guy with some ball production. And I would just caution against thinking that line of thinking there, because first of all, Des King is going to have a very different role on the Steelers than what Hayden did when he came along. And I think Hayden was a much more established player by that point too, like just interceptions galore, 101 passes defended by the time he came over. So very different football players. They do have a similar like body type, frame, the stockier build with some ball skills. But I think King's role is going to be that slot corner for the Steelers.
Yeah, and I think how I choose to view this is they wanted to have someone who could play not as well as Cameron Sutton, but in the same way, where he's an inside-out player, because King did play more snaps on the outside last year than in the slot.
Yeah.
Now, I like him more as a slot player. I think he's going to play a pretty much entirely slot for us if we can get away with it. But him having the versatility to go a step outside if you need him to is definitely nice, considering our outside corner depth is not great at the moment, even with 7 guys on the team right now at corner. And we'll talk about the roster a little bit later with those guys. But this is one of those floor-raising, slight ceiling-raising moves for me. Like, I think the ceiling of the cornerback room gets a little bit bigger or higher just because this is an established player who has bounced back a little bit after, like you said, a rough 2021. There's expectations of what you can get out of him even at 28 years old. So it settles the slot corner position a lot, because Sullivan and Riley played well enough in the preseason to earn roster spots. But that doesn't mean a whole lot on a corner room where there's no other slot corners, right? Like, it doesn't mean that they're great.
Yeah.
So King, I think, can come in and immediately take that slot role over and play a little bit outside if we need him to. And again, it just kind of creates a better numbers game with the corner room, right? Like, it just creates more opportunities for guys to play in the best spots for them. I think Riley will still have a role. I think Sullivan could still sort of have a role at times, but ideally King is going to be the primary slot player for them this year now.
Yeah, and you talked about his versatility. My goodness, this guy, he can play outside in the slot. He's played free safety.
Yes, I think he's played safety snaps.
He's such a headsy player and so aware that I think that you can play him pretty much anywhere in the secondary and expect at least a baseline level of play from him. Now, the downfall of a player like King is you're not getting a big, tall, long guy. You're getting more of the compact type player. And you're not getting a great athlete either. I mean, this guy ran a 4.6 coming into the NFL. We can probably assume that this long into his career, he's not faster than he was. He probably lost a step maybe at this point. That's okay if you're going to be good in the phases that he's good at right now. And so, but I do think, I mean, just looking at the roster construction, Shayne, it's very easy to pigeonhole him in that slot role for the Steelers. Pittsburgh has 3 guys that can play on the outside with Peterson and Levi Wallace and Joey Porter being that third guy who we would assume eventually take over the starting spot on that defense. And I think that you look at the competition is just weak I mean, there's really no other way to put it at slot cornerback with Chandon Sullivan and Elijah Riley. Like Sullivan wasn't good in Minnesota. Riley is very much unproven. And not that either of those guys can't be good in Pittsburgh this year, but I think they were making sure their bases were covered. You're getting a veteran who's got loads of experience all around at cornerback, but also in the slot, got 334 snaps there last year. And so I think that this is a safe but unspectacular signing. Like I would be really surprised if he played like at some Pro Bowl level.
Right.
But I think that and more so like likening him to a player like Hayden. I think honestly, his skill set is closer to a player like Mike Hilton at this point, where
yes,
you can blitz, you can defend the run, and you can do everything from the slot or outside if he needs to, something that Hilton really couldn't do. But I think he's just primarily going to be that slot cornerback for the Steelers. All right. We're going to move on to our first discussion topic here. If you have any questions for us, please drop them in the chat and we will try to get to those.
We do have one chat that's pretty funny. For the first part of this here, trade for Aaron Donald, that'd be great. Probably not going to happen. I think the Rams are happy to keep him for now. Second part here, pass. We don't need another running back that doesn't play special teams really. And Ant Mac is already halfway there sometimes. So I don't think
I'm comfortable with the Steelers running back room. I really am. And the Aaron Donald thing, I mean, it is just one of those pipe dreams at this point. I mean, we would love the pit connection and everything that way. But now in terms of like the Rams purposes, I think there's a lot of incentive. If you look at how bad their roster is, to say, let's get as much draft capital as we can for the only guys that are worth anything on our team right now. But at the same time, those are the only guys that are worth anything on their team. So they probably want to stay somewhat competitive if they can. I don't think that's happening, unfortunately, for Steelers fans. All right, let's dissect the 53-man roster on the Pittsburgh Steelers this year. We know their initial roster. There's only been one move since, and that move was signing Des King. And in place of that, the Steelers made one corresponding roster move. They got rid of their second punter. So that's where that second punter comes into play there. Braden Mann will not be with the Steelers. I don't think anybody really expected him to be, but that is official now that he is gone. So back to a square 53 right there on that roster. We're going to go position by position here. If you have any thoughts, please chime in on the chat. We'd love to hear what you have to think about any of these guys. And Shayne and I will share our thoughts as well. Shayne, let's start right at the top here. We'll go kind of like the Madden order with the quarterback. So three quarterbacks, not surprising in the slightest. You got Kenny Pickett, Mitch Trubisky, Mason Rudolph in that order. Those are your three guys, and I don't see that changing.
Yeah, this one we don't have to spend too much time with as far as dissecting it. We kind of knew this was going to be the case pretty much from the get-go, right? Like we didn't really have to worry about, as much as, I appreciate Tanner Morgan sticking around the football for feels like 12 years. I didn't think he was going to take over that third spot from Mason. So honestly, I think the only thing interesting about this is is at some point, if Mitch comes in, if he has to, and he's not good, does Mason eventually supplant him as the backup? I think that's a question that's fair to ask. But outside of that, we know what Kenny is going to be at this point. I think especially with the way the preseason went, he's going to be playing all the games as long as he's healthy. So there's really no concerns here for quarterback.
Yeah, and there was never a shot that Tanner Morgan was getting that job. Regardless of what you thought about Mason Rudolph, if you think that Mason Rudolph doesn't have what it takes, you watch Tanner Morgan a little bit during his Steelers preseason and his time at Minnesota. Just did not have a lot to work with. I don't mean to be too hard on the guy. He's made it.
He had an uphill climb.
That's for sure. He had his work cut out for him. And so we knew that it was going to be these three guys all along. And it does get interesting because there's a debate to be made. Like Trubisky was not spectacular this preseason. So
didn't look great.
I will be fine with anybody that wants to make the case for Mason Rudolph there. It's just the money tells you otherwise. It's going to be Trubisky as the backup. Rudolph is going to be the clipboard guy. Those are going to be your three. And it's fun to say, oh, maybe they can snatch a guy like Bailey Zappi, or Will Grier was fun in the preseason, but it's just not realistic. I think the Steelers are very comfortable with what they have there.
I will say real quick before we move on to running back, this is just me personally. I think if we are in a situation where one of these two have to come in, so if there's a backup situation where Kenny goes down or whatever, if we're currently winning the game, I think that Mitch would be fine because he's not going to probably try to do anything because he's afraid to do anything to screw it up. If we're losing, I would put Rudolph in. I'm just going to throw it out there. I think that he would give us a better chance to win. I just think he's more willing to try to do stuff that would lead to win. That's just my thought with it at this point.
But. Yeah, and it's worth reminding everybody again, too, of the new rule change when it comes to quarterback actives. You are allowed to have a third active quarterback now on game day that does not count against your 45-man active roster. So one additional to that, which is nice because if you get in a pinch, you'd like to be able to play a quarterback instead of just somebody else out there, or give yourself an option, at least like if your backup quarterback is really struggling, give yourself something else to go to. So that's a rule that could benefit the Steelers. Obviously, we hope to never see it in play. So that Pickett is on the field for every snap in all 17 games. So that's hopeful thinking there. Running back position, Shayne. Steelers had 3 running backs make the roster. They were the 3 that you and I predicted. Obviously, those 3 are Najee Harris, Jaylen Warren, and Anthony McFarland makes the roster with no Benny Snell on the team this year. The Steelers went a different route, Shayne, and this is the one that I still don't feel super confident like the Steelers are not going to go out and try to do something else here, just because if you look at Tomlin's history, like that third running back has always had to be a guy who can play and contribute on special teams. And McFarland can't do that outside of some kick return ability, which again, you use very sparingly today's NFL. Heck, you can fair catch the kick return anywhere
and get it
now.
Get to 25,
yes. So it really is not that important. You can put a lot of guys back there and it's not going to make a big difference. So I will be interested to see if there's movement on that front. I want McFarland to stay. And I've been vocal about that before because I think there's a lot of value in a guy that has home run speed like he does. You can crack off a 20, 30, 40-yard run and instantly get into field goal range for 3 points. I think there's value in that guy. He's going to be a guy that goes down on first contact. We're just going to have to deal with that. But I do think that he offers something different than those other 2 guys do on the roster.
Yeah, and again, I'm glad that he's currently on the active roster. I think that as much as this team has always had a third running back that is the primary special team or one of them, I'd like it to be someone else in this situation just because, again, we didn't have that guy in camp. Now, again, if someone pops open, which so far haven't claimed anybody off waivers or anything like that, but if they want to make that move at some point, then so be it. But again, I think there's value in having a player, offensively. Like, for example, I'd rather have McFarland on the roster than Olszewski, for example, if I had to pick between those 2. We didn't have to. We'll talk about receivers next. But because I know that McFarland at least has potential to impact the offensive side of the ball more so than a guy like he would. So, like, I'd rather have that third running back position, all things, kept the same, be somebody who can actually provide value offensively if possible.
Yeah, and why not keep your running backs fresh? I mean, I don't think that you don't need Najee to be a guy that runs the ball 300 plus times. You have Warren is more than capable, and I think he's going to prove that again this year. He was incredibly efficient with his touches, but McFarland is a guy that I'm like, I want him to get 2 to 4 carries a game. Like, just put him out there and see what happens. If he gets stuffed in a couple of runs, be it. That's going to happen with him. But if there's a crease there, he has the ability to take it to the house from any distance. And so I think that could add another element. It's just very different. Like you can look back years, like the Gary Russells and Najee Davenports of the world. Tomlin loved those third running backs to be guys that can, those hard-nosed guys like the Benny Snells who can contribute on special teams. And that is very different than what McFarland is. He is more of the, I'm just gonna be a splash player on offense and potentially get a home run threat there.
Right.
Just another reminder, if you guys are joining us here in the live chat, please drop any questions or comments you might have in the chat for us. We'd love to be able to get to those for you. And we're going to plug away here. Let's move on to the wide receiver position. Again, we're talking about the Steelers' 53-man depth chart, their initial signings here, plus the one roster change they had with Des King. We're at the wide receiver position now, Shayne. And I predicted the Steelers would keep 6 receivers for the second straight year. I predicted that they would be these 6 guys, and I think that you had the same prediction. Am I correct?
Roughly. I said the Gunner's the only one who I was wondering if they might keep an extra guy somewhere else. But this, if there was going to be 6, we knew it was going to be this 6, right? Like that's kind of what it's been all camp in terms of order of these guys playing. And obviously the last 2 guys in the roster, Boykin and Olszewski, are going to be mostly, special teamers, plus maybe, because as we like to know, as we saw, he likes to put them in there for run game stuff, but might see the field offensively for that. But other than that, those 2 are going to be the special teamers, and those top 4 who we're going to really be talking about throughout the year.
Yeah, and it almost makes me wonder too, because I know that you're suddenly pretty deep at the position. You've got Calvin Austin, had a great summer.
Yeah.
It makes me wonder if Olszewski is a little bit of Calvin Austin insurance. If that guy were to go down again, where you can do all the jet sweep stuff, you can do kick and punt return. I mean, this guy was an all-pro return man in the past, was awesome in New England. Not so good as a returner last year with the Steelers.
Yeah.
But he does offer a lot of versatility in terms of that. He can play in the slot, in a pinch if you need him to. But a guy that's probably just going to again, special teams chops, 6 receiver. The Steelers, you can look, there's not really a set trend there. I mean, a couple years back when they had like Juju James-Washington, there was only 5 receivers on the roster. And so people had the right to question whether or not they were going to cut back this year, being a little bit deeper at the position than they have been before. Maybe they just decided to keep the 6th receiver there, and we'll see. I don't think that he's going to be a guy with his roster spot is safe throughout the entirety of the season. It's going to depend on his performance, I think.
Yeah, I would say so as well.
All right, let's move on to tight end here. The biggest surprise mover, one of the, at least, would you call it the biggest, Shayne, of the roster cuts?
I mean, of the cuts, I think so, just because, again, he's the most established player with the Steelers specifically that was let go. For at this point, I think so, yeah.
So we have Zach Gentry is no more. Pat waved goodbye to him. Kind of an emotional thing there. Those guys were besties, and they obviously did the grilling and chilling show with each other. But the Steelers are rolling with just 3 tight ends / call whatever James Conner, or excuse me, Connor Hayward you want. Don't know why I got James Conner on the mind here.
That's right.
Pat Freiermuth's going to be their starting tight end, their F there. Apparently they're comfortable enough with Darnell Washington to step right into that role as a rookie as the Y tight end. And then Connor Hayward's going to be that fullback, H-back, running back, slot receiver. Wherever you want to put the guy, he's going to perform, I would expect, at a pretty high level. Just a very smart, savvy football player there. So just rolling with 3.
Yeah, and I think if they were going to only keep 3, this was going to be the 3, right? And I think it says a lot about Washington and his ability to step in right away and be the tight end too. And we talked about it earlier in the summer that I think Gentry's role is going to be determined whether it's either not on the roster at all, like it isn't right now, or whether he's an inactive on game is going to be based on whether Washington's ready to go. And I think he showed in the preseason and in camp that he is ready to go. And unfortunately, that just means that Gentry wasn't quite needed, unfortunately. And I think there's a chance that we could see him again at some point this year, whether it's because of just shaking up the roster or whatever. But in general, this isn't that surprising to me overall, though, because Washington was great and Hayward can fill that 3rd tight end / full, like whatever position you want to play him at, running back, whatever. Like, and I think that also having him is part of why I think that McFarland is the 3rd back right now, and there hasn't been a ton of effort to replace him because Hayward is that kind of special teams running back technically at this point.
Yeah, and don't be too hard on the media. I mean, everybody had the right to put Gentry on the roster because look at it this way. The Steelers did not bring Derek Watt back this season. There was an open spot open on offense, and especially if you want to say, we're gonna label Hayward as that fullback-ish type guy, well, then you still have room for 3 true tight ends if that's how you want to do it. And so regardless, between the fullback and tight end position, there were 4 guys last year. There's only 3 guys this year. So it was safe to assume that Gentry could have played. And even I had him in my final roster prediction. What I thought would happen, Shayne, is I didn't know. I mean, Washington flashes for sure, but he's also got a lot to work on still. And so I wondered if the Steelers were going to keep Gentry around, have him be that kind of the starting Y tight end, which that number 2 tight end with Freiermuth, in 12 personnel, 22 personnel, that kind of extra offensive tackle. You have him as the inline blocker. And I thought he would do that for maybe 5 or 6 games before Washington really took that role over. And at that point, I thought, yes, Gentry could be released and they wouldn't think twice about it. But releasing him at the beginning of the season before the season even takes place is a little bit surprising to me because you are entrusting Washington with a pretty big role there. And I think that they're just going to take their lumps with him. And I'm fine with that too. Washington is clearly the more talented player of the 2. And I think the upside is huge there to be that Mercedes Lewis type inline blocker for the Steelers. So that's what we're hoping for. And those are your 3. Again, if you are joining us here in the live chat, make sure you drop your questions.
We do have a quick question here. Now, this is one that I think asking, if you were to ask Washington this in the future, might be physically possible. Gentry would never be a tackle.
Yeah, the ship has sailed on Gentry, and though Gentry had the size and length to do it, I mean, you have to make that transition so early.
Yeah, you got to pack on weight and everything else. Yeah,
it's a worthwhile discussion topic when you talk about a player who was as dominant of a blocker as Washington was in college, because this guy has some amazing strength for being 6'7", 270. It's not an impossible thought. I mean, he's not that different from a physique standpoint as like a Lane Johnson coming into the NFL. And so there's a discussion to be made. Yeah. If you're willing to do maybe a 3-year, 2 or 3 year transition and say, we're going to add bulk to you, you're not going to be ready to do it until a couple of years down the line, but we think that you can be a Pro Bowl tackle, then there's a discussion to be made there that's more valuable than having that number 2 tight end. And so sure, there's a discussion there, not with Gentry anymore at this point, now that he's been released. And now that he's just at this stage of his career, he's basically is what he is type of guy at this point. All right, Shayne, let's move on to the offensive line.
Speaking
of the players that made it here for us, obviously, if you got the starting 5 from left to right with Dan Moore, Isaac Seumalo, Mason Cole, James Daniels, and Chukwuma Okorafor, Broderick Jones is going to be your backup offensive tackle with Nate Herbig as probably your swing interior offensive lineman. The Steelers decided to keep rookie Spencer Anderson, which is great. And they also kept Dylan Cook, who is kind of the biggest underdog, I would say, on the roster here. Came on strong these last couple of weeks. And so they give themselves a little bit more versatility and one more depth piece on the offensive line there. And maybe that's part of what made some of these trades possible. Doesn't exactly play that position, but just to have the added depth on the line and a guy that they really liked a lot this summer in Cook.
Yeah, I think Cook making the roster is well-deserved, first of all, but also important because, again, you have 2 tackles who haven't been exactly great so far in their careers, especially Okorafor lately has not been very good, and you hope more can still develop. But 2 guys who are not exactly high-level starters. You have a rookie who, yeah, we have a lot of high expectations for, but if he has to come in, how good is he going to be? So having a 4th tackle who played really well in camp and earned a spot is really important. Guy was a former quarterback, good athlete. Like, I like the story and I like the fit with the Steelers for sure. I think that he could carve out a long-term backup role with us, hopefully. And then the rest of the guys, not that surprising. So when you trade away Dotson and Green, we felt that they were going to keep 9 guys total. It's just going to be which 9. And Anderson making the roster makes a lot of sense because, again, he's 7th round pick, low contract, can play a lot of spots. Even tackle in a pinch, I guess. But I still view him as an interior player. But generally, good depth across the backup offensive lineman. Then.
Yeah, and if you were someone out there that predicted these 9 players correctly, then kudos to you, because in the way that it happened, I don't think anybody would have said, yeah, Steelers are trading 2 of these guys.
Yeah, right.
And then Dylan Cook's going to stay. And so definitely a little bit different than I projected the bottom of the roster to turn out. I didn't have Kendrick Green making the roster. I did have Dotson making the roster, but I also said
he's
many times leading up to that point, I'm like, there's a very good chance that the team could look to move him. And they ultimately decided to do that. But yeah, good for Dylan Cook making that squad. And this is it's a deeper unit than it has been in the past. If we look at this group last year, had an injury occurred last year, they could have been in trouble pretty quickly. This year now it's like, yes, you're going to have a drop off anytime you go from a starter to a backup. But I mean, there's an argument to be made, at tackle, maybe a couple weeks into the season, Broderick is already the best of the 3. I mean, he's that talented that you can see the guy. Go back and watch his all 22 film during the preseason. I mean, the footwork is so sloppy at times. This guy's crossing his legs, and then somehow he just jets over and gets back in front of the edge rusher and recovers. I'm like, how did you just do that? If he can clean up his technique, the sky's the limit for him. So I'll be interested to see when he finally gets on the field there.
Yeah, I think overall, just like you said, the depth, as we talked about for a second, I think any one of these guys that are starters could get hurt, and whoever comes in for them is at least going to be a similar caliber player overall, right? Now, granted, the interior is a little bit different because if it's Cole, you can shift things around and probably get something out there that resembles that. But the 2 starting guards are obviously significantly better than Herbig is, but Herbig is still a quality player who has started games in the league. This is not a guy who's terrible by any means. That's the reason why he's on the team and why they gave him a decent contract as a backup. So for the first time in a long time, it feels like, I'm not super concerned about where the offensive line currently stands. So,
yeah, and if you look across the board here real quick, if something were to happen to Dan Moore, Broderick steps in, and that's your line. If something happens to Okorafor at right tackle, that at that point, I think Dan Moore goes to right. Broderick steps in.
Most likely,
something happens at either guard spot. You've got Nate Herbig stepping in. The most interesting one will be if something happens to Mason Cole at center. Is it Herbig? Like, is Herbig the guy? Are they still looking for somebody? Yeah. Do you shuffle at all? Like, I mean, James Daniels was a center in college, but I don't know if you're going back to him at that point.
I think the question becomes, do you like Herbig at guard and Daniels at center more than you like Herbig at center? And
I
Daniels
do like that pairing.
Yeah.
It's been a while since Daniels has
done That's
it.
the problem. Is I think that, like, if you think that Daniels is so much better at guard than he is at center at this point, it would make more sense to have the weak link be center and have the strong player be a guard still. Because then you can protect Herbig as a center against speed and things like that. You can do things to help him because he's not a natural center. He can play it, obviously. That's one of the reasons he was signed. But he's a bigger guy. Like, he's not really that movement center, which, granted, with our scheme isn't super important anyway. But it's something that you can protect against a little bit better. And then you keep Daniels at the position that he's been excelling at now for several years in the NFL. So
yeah, and if you I'm hoping that Herbig can be like that BJ Finney type guy. That
exactly.
Can just be the
like wherever you need to go, go do it.
Plug him in, and he's going to be at least a serviceable to quality player in that role. And I'm excited for Spencer Anderson too. I think this is a guy that's a little bit, I mean, very much unknown by a lot of people just like coming into the draft because he just was unranked. But he's an athlete. He's versatile. He showed he can play like 4 or 5 positions on the offensive line. Where I want him to focus on it, where I want the team to focus him in at would be at center ideally, because based on his build, his frame, his lack of length, which is concerning as a tackle. He can get away with it as a guard, but I think he projects best as a center in the NFL. So if he can kind of maybe slowly start transition, you're a guard and moving to center now, I think that would be best for his future career path, but we'll see where that leads him. All right, Shayne, let's go to the defensive side of the football, and we're going to talk about the interior defensive linemen here, the ones that made the squad for the Steelers. We knew 4 of these guys for sure were roster locks, those being Cameron Hayward, Larry Ogunjobi, DeMarvin Leal, and Keanu Benton. Those guys were never in question based on contracts, talents, draft picks. And then the guys that we have making the team after that are Montravius Adams, Isaiah Loudermilk, and Armon Watts. In our last show, Shayne, I kind of went back and forth. I'm like, I was not convinced at all that Loudermilk and Watts could make the team together because they play such a similar role. And it looks like the Steelers were content just kind of devoting that extra spot there, a little bit of resources. And it's Braden Fajoku who is the odd man out.
Yeah, and I think that realistically, it makes sense because you would have had 3, even though Benton's not really a nose, and you could argue Adams isn't really either, but they were listed, all 3 of those guys, including Fajoku, were listed at nose. You realistically, do you need 3 nose tackles? I don't think so. I don't think Fajoku is going to play very much, if at all, honestly. And even though he's the only true run stopper, Benton's done a real good job in the preseason as a run stopper. I don't think he's going to be a liability, at least, even as much as I thought he might be starting off, just because, again, I do think he's really more developed as a pass rusher than a run stopper at this point. But he showed enough to me for me to feel comfortable putting him out there. And, Adams is technically the starter right now. We'll see how long that lasts for. But I think the rest of the guys, if you're not going to keep Fajoku, this is who you keep, right? I think that's who's going to make the roster and who did for that reason. And as much as, again, Loudermilk hasn't truly developed that much, Watts is just kind of a pretty basic backup, 3-tech, 5-tech type. All these guys are good enough to make the roster. I'm not going to sit here and complain about these guys making the roster. So overall, this is a pretty strong defensive line, especially at the top. We know that. But overall, I'm not super concerned about any of these guys, if they have to come in and play at this point.
Yeah, I was pleased with this group. Fajoku was the guy that I wanted gone. He just offers no pass rush chops at all. I think it's all run defense, and even the run defense wasn't spectacular.
Right.
And
it would have to be better than it was and has been.
A very limited one down player, really. And so he was the one that I would have cut from this group. If they had to cut another, I mean, it's hard because Watts had a strong summer. I think that you could argue that Adams is just unspectacular, but at the same time, for the reason you already said, they label him as that nose tackle type, even though I don't think that's probably his best role anyway, but that's where he's been playing for the Steelers. So we knew that they were going to keep at least 2 of those guys there. So not surprising to see the defensive line turn out the way that it did for the Steelers. And that's the group that I would have gone with too. So I'm pleased with that. Let's move on to the edge defenders here, the outside linebackers, if you will, for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And Shayne, something that always irks me is the Steelers put out their initial depth chart. I talk about this too much. I know that I do, and people get annoyed with me, but in their initial depth chart, they just have linebackers just listed as a spectrum, just linebackers. I'm like, what TJ Watt does is going to be very, very different than what Cole Holcomb does or Quan Alexander does this year. So they are distinctly different positions. And so I like the new classification of edge defenders in the NFL. You can call them outside linebackers. Just know that these guys are, I mean, for the most part, you're looking at hand in the dirt, 4 guys on the defensive line type of rush the passer type. So anyway, I give you my little spiel. I do that too often, but our edge players making the team, we knew that it's going to be 4. This is a trend that the Steelers never break. And we knew who those 4 were going to be. That was pretty straightforward from the get-go here. TJ Watt, Alex Highsmith, Nick Herbig, and Marcus Golden. And you can, I mean, the order that I say these doesn't really matter. Golden's going to be probably that guy, that third guy to begin with, but I think it will be Nick Herbig. Eventually, Herbig was awesome this summer. He gets my defensive game ball for the Steelers. That's the group, right? No questions ever there.
No, that was never going to be a question. And it's more to your point about the linebackers. And I think that ideally they would have it set up as edge defenders and linebackers on the depth chart of the roster, just because we all know that, right? Like, and this is something that I don't want to even remotely get into a spiel about this particular topic because I could spend an hour doing it. But Madden does the same thing where they just have outside linebackers.
Oh, it's so annoying. Yeah.
I'm like, teams don't know what is what. You have outside linebackers playing edge player, like as edge players whenever they're like 220 pounds. Like that's a whole other problem. But basically, I would love it to be like either one of two things: either 3-4 edge and 4-3 edge. Even though again, base is nickel at this point.
That's better at least, yes.
Or stand up edge and hand in dirt type of like one of the two. Because like generally, you're going to get more of the stand up edges be the outside linebackers, obviously.
Yeah.
Although that even varies too. I mean, TJ's has his hand in dirt a lot, but it is what it is. But yeah, these 4 guys, right? Like we know this is going to be the 4. TJ and Alex are going to play most of the snaps we expect, and hopefully a little bit less than they've had to play recently. Keep fresher, but like you said, Herbig is eventually going to be the first guy off the bench whenever they need a pass rusher. Golden is still a good player. He's still probably going to be the guy that gets the most snaps to start the season, just because he also, I think, is more stout against the run, even though if Herbig's maybe a little bit more of a playmaker against the run, I would say. So it's going to kind of trade off there. But as we saw throughout the training camp and through the preseason games, Herbig is going to be that guy sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and looking like ahead to the future, like obviously the focus is all on this year, but I think that Golden's very much going to be probably the one and done type of guy for the Steelers, especially
you expect.
If Herbig turns out, this Pittsburgh typically needs that 4th edge. If he drops down to 4th edge, you need that guy to be able to contribute on special teams.
At least
and that's
a little bit, yeah.
I don't think that Golden's going to do. So we will see what happens there. I'm excited for Herbig. I mean, how could you not be after what he showed? It was just the preseason. I don't want to get too worked up about that, but the guy was spectacular. I mean, he was all over, and just it's not just the statistical production. Like I could care less about that when you just watch
his film
play.
Was something else.
Yes, the film was remarkable. I mean, earned just like a 90.6 PFF grade throughout the entirety of the preseason. He just looked good. And so I'm very optimistic, at least, that not only is he going to stick there, he could be a pretty good player down the line that really carves out a big role for them. All right, let's move on to linebackers here. This was a big discussion topic throughout the offseason, really. I mean, dating back to the time that Khan decided to wipe the slate clean. And I don't blame him at all for doing that. Props to him because it needed to be done. I mean, Miles Jack, Devin Bush, Robert Spillane, we're not getting the job done. And so we can't guarantee that this group of Holcomb and Quan and Elandon Roberts is going to be better than what they had before. But there's probably a pretty good chance that it is based on just the aggressiveness we've seen from these guys. So again, that group is going to be Cole Holcomb's the guy that got the money this offseason. Elandon Roberts, second highest paid in that positional group, going to be starting alongside him as that buck linebacker. Quan Alexander comes in on a cheap deal, but should have a pretty big role on Steelers defense. The Steelers kept Mark Robinson for the 2nd straight year, former 7th rounder. And that's it. And this is where the surprise comes in, Shayne, because the Steelers they chose to break another trend here at this positional group, because I went back and looked at their depth chart history at our lads. It's been since 2017 was the last time they kept only 4 of the off-ball linebackers on their roster. Yes, those type of guys. And so you're going back a ways now. And if you recall, back in 2017, they were pretty solid up front with Ryan Shazier and Vince Williams. So they didn't necessarily need to keep a bunch of extra depth there. We don't know exactly what we're getting from these guys here. The Steelers did spend some resources, but I am a little bit surprised to see both Tanner Muse and Nick Kwiatkowski gone from this team. I thought that one of the two would be kept as that basically the Matakavage guy, your special teams guy who carves out like 200 to 300 special team snaps. And right now they don't have that guy. So are they bringing in another? Are they content with what they have just for at the position? And are you going to make up the difference somewhere else? Because also, not only that, Shayne, but you don't have the Benny Snell guy either that could take up those added special team snaps as a guy with that type of physique in that role.
It's going to be really interesting to see if they make any more moves, specifically at linebacker. And I think if you do, where you'll see a corresponding move is corner, which we'll be talking about here in a little bit.
I would think so.
You assume so, but we'll get to that in a second. But I do think it's interesting because Muse was picked up by the Chargers for their 53-man. They claimed him off waivers, so it won't be Muse at least right now. Which that's just a little disappointing because we talked about him a lot. I liked him as a special teamer and at least possible rangy cover type guy. But I do expect it. Like if there's going to be a move, this is where it's going to be, and that's just because again, you look at historical trends. It's been a long time since we have had only 4 guys, and it was when we were in a better position than we are now. Even though I like the group that we brought in, it's still a better position, than last year, of course, but not quite as strong as it was in 2017. So we'll see if they make a move. But I do think that Holcomb and Roberts and Alexander, I think that all 3 of those guys are going to play a lot of snaps. I think if I had to guess, Roberts and Alexander play a similar amount of snaps overall. But those 3 especially, and then Robinson getting put in there whenever they need him to be in there, should be a much improved group, like you said.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, you liken him to the guys last year in terms of roles. I mean, I think that Holcomb is stepping into that Devin Bush role and Roberts stepping into the Jack role. And then you have the Spillane, who the Steelers thought he was a great coverage linebacker.
They seem to think so, yeah, for whatever reason.
But I do think that Quan will play quite a bit in coverage type situations.
Especially those situations, yeah.
He's got some chops there. He's got some quicks. And so it'll be interesting to see. And then Holcomb will probably ultimately be that 3-down guy that rarely comes off the field, I would think. And maybe Steelers start doing more dime this year, but we'll see. That's your group as of now. And I don't see it. One of these guys isn't going to be removed from the roster. It's just a question of, do they add a 5th there?
Yes. Yeah.
All right, let's move on to cornerback here. Shayne, in this one, turned out to be an interesting group because, again, Steelers just added Desmond King to that rotation here now. So your cornerbacks for the Pittsburgh Steelers in 2023 are Patrick Peterson, Joey Porter Jr., Levi Wallace, Desmond King. Who else we got here? Shannon Sullivan, Elijah Riley. Did I miss anybody?
James Pierre,
because we don't know what's going on with this guy. Maybe he sticks around. And I do think that he was a good story early on. The thing is, I've not seen any progression really with him since his undrafted rookie year when he came on the squad. In fact, I thought that this might have been his worst preseason of the 3 that he's had so far, 3 or 4. Can't remember. I think this is his 3rd. But it wasn't great. It's just it definitely got beat up a little bit, got picked on these last couple of games in the passing game. You can tell that he just doesn't have those quicks and speed that you need at that position. So wouldn't be surprised to see him get exchanged maybe for a different boundary cornerback at the bottom of this roster.
Yeah, I think a move at corner's happening at some point. It's just, is it a swap for one cornerback for another? Is it a losing a corner and picking up a linebacker like we just talked about? And honestly, I think as far as like who gets the axe from this corner room, as much as Pierre's been struggling, I'm just going to pick the guy who I think has the least special teams value, because realistically, we have 3 slot corners technically right now. Yeah. Do we need 3 slot corners? Mm-hmm. Well, I like Riley a lot as a special teamer and as a slot corner. So like maybe Sullivan is the odd man out, and then maybe they swap Pierre for somebody else. Like whatever it ends up being, I do think there's gonna be some sort of move there. It's just gonna be, who is the initial move? Is it a cut? Is it a swap? And then also like what position do they try to add more from that swap there? So
Yeah, because it is really interesting that they are sitting currently with 3 slot corners, really. I mean,
or at least primary
Des can
slot
play.
corners.
Yeah, Des can play outside, but he's going to play the slot for the Steelers. I mean, that's where he projects. So, I mean, you look at it that way, it's like, all right, what do you do now? Like, I'm okay if they wanted to get rid of a Chandon Sullivan. I thought he had a pretty strong finish to his preseason as well. But at least I feel more optimistic. Like maybe Elijah Riley can give you a spark, because I've seen a lot of Sullivan on the Vikings the last 2 years. And obviously we know that sample wasn't awesome. So it comes down to, are the Steelers going to roll with what they have right now? Or do you keep 3 slot cornerbacks? Do you swap out Pierre? One move that I really wanted them to pull off
I saw
before
you
the
talk
deadline,
about this.
and I wrote about it too. It was Calvin Joseph. Like I knew that Calvin Joseph was going to be that guy that maybe got the axe for Dallas. And we were talking about a talented player, former Kentucky guy that was a 2nd-round pick, athletic, 4.3-ish speed, size, and length. And so that's a guy that I would have been, and he's been good on special teams as well and carved out a big role there for Dallas. But I would have swapped Pierre for him. And if I got to throw in a late conditional round pick or whatever to appease Dallas, that's fine. They ended up swapping him for Noah from I'm not going to even try the last name right now.
Is how you say it. I think it's
I always butcher it. So in former 1st-round pick, who's just been an absolute bust for Miami.
Yeah.
So, I mean, they were willing to just take a gamble anyway, knowing that Joseph was going to get cut. So I think the Steelers could have pulled something off there. I'm not faulting Khan for anything or Weidl. Those guys did a great job. I think with just getting picks out of who they got so far. So if worst case, if Pierre sticks around, he probably rarely sees the field on defense and is just going to be that core special teams player like he has been these past couple of years.
Yeah.
All right, Shayne, let's talk about the safety position real quick, and we'll get ready to wrap things up here in the next few minutes. No surprises at the safety position other than we thought they might keep a Kenny Robinson and or a Trey Norwood and or a
Trenton Thompson.
Trenton Thompson.
Yeah.
They chose to keep none of the 3. I predicted they would keep one of the 3. I didn't think they would get rid of all 3 of them. And so they, again, cut back a little bit right here. You got Minka, DeMonte KZ, Keanu Neal, and Miles Killebrew as probably going to be your special teams team captain again this year for the Steelers. So those 4 are not surprising. I had them going with a 5th, and they ultimately landed on Trenton Thompson, I think, because of what he was able to do. And I have to remember that it was Thompson or Norwood. Norwood had the experience, but I think I went with the hot hand being Thompson, who had the pretty strong summer here. They just went with 4 here.
Yeah, and this is what I predicted, because I feel like they view Riley as also a 4th safety because he's played that position before. I think that's kind of where that comes into play, where they wanted the special teamer in Killebrew, but I think they didn't see enough, at least consistency-wise, from Robinson. He had a hot start to camp, but then kind of really faltered down the stretch. Thompson had his moments, but again, player that you didn't really know what you're going to get out of him if he had to play defense. And then Norwood was just hurt a lot of camp, right? And I think that he'll come back on the practice squad if I had to guess, at least a couple of those guys, if not all of them maybe. But this 4 is who I expected. And then now you have Desmond King, who we talked about again. If you need him to play safety in a pinch, can do that if you want him to. But I think those top 3 guys are going to get obviously pretty much all the snaps. And then if you need to move somebody back there to help out, you can do that with some of these guys.
Yep, that's basically what it's going to be. I think that, we know that Killebrew at this stage in his career, just a special teams guy. You're not going to want to see him out there too often.
He'd be more of a linebacker if he had to play than a safety at this point.
Yeah, for sure, I think. And Neal is kind of that way too. But I think if something were to happen to one of their top 3 safeties, they're definitely moving a guy, or any of the safeties. They're going to move a guy up. And then you probably get that added depth where you need it.
Yeah.
I'm fine with that. The 4 is good with me. I didn't think that Trenton Thompson was so spectacular that you had to keep him on the roster. Right. It wasn't one of those situations. And they've got Minka, obviously, he's going to play every snap, and you can kind of rotate the other 2 guys there as needed. I still think KC is going to be better overall than Keanu Neal.
Agreed.
But those 2 guys have big injury histories too. So it's always a little bit of a gamble. If you decide to go a little bit thin at the safety position, you got to hope that you can get a quality player on the practice squad, bring him back up. So we'll see what happens there. And obviously we hope that those guys have good health throughout the season. All right. And in last category here, we got special teams. These are the 3 guys that we thought they would be. Formerly, Braden Mann would have made the 4th player. And we wondered why he was kept at the beginning. And I think I put that, we'll get that in a second. So we got Chris Boswell. We got Presley Harvin. Braden Mann, no longer here, was that fourth. And then Christian Kuntz, the long snapper. These are the three that we thought we would make the final roster from the beginning. I don't think there was really ever much of a question. I think the biggest one came between, could it be Braden Mann, who was a former starting punter in the NFL, or are they sticking with Harbin? They chose to stick with Harbin, which I think both you and I predicted.
Yeah, this is what I predicted. And something fun you can do is if you want to know if your friends actually watch Steelers games or just talk about the Steelers, ask them whether they think Presley Harvin had a good preseason, because a lot of people think that he was terrible because his net average was like in the 30s. But it's because he was coffin cornering all of his punts. Like he wasn't playing bad, he just wasn't getting the chance to boom kicks.
Box score checking is a dangerous game.
It's fun, right? It's just be like, hey, what do you think about Presley Harvin being the? Oh, he's terrible. You'll know if they watch the games or not. So that's something fun you can play. But yeah, these are the three that we expected and who will be the special teamers barring injury the rest of the year.
Yep, that's right. All right, if you are a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and you would like to support the Steel Curtain podcast, please consider subscribing to the Steel Curtain podcast on YouTube. We appreciate all of your support, and tell your friends about us too. Yes, all right, Shayne, we're going to run through this last discussion topic real quickly here. I know it's kind of a longer show for us today. We're going to talk about the biggest questions following the aftermath of roster cut down day. So let's start off with who was snubbed. Did you think that anybody, if anybody on the Steelers, who was snubbed this year?
I don't want to say snubbed because, like I said, there wasn't really a lot of surprises. I think the two you could argue is Muse and Gentry, just because Muse, the fifth linebacker, typically expect him to keep one. So him not only getting cut, but then picked up immediately by the Chargers is interesting. And then Gentry, just the guy that, like you said, he doesn't know. It's fun. Steelers fans like him in general. There's nothing wrong with the guys. So you could say he was snubbed a little bit, but again, you have a lot of guys on this team this year, a lot more depth across the roster, and it was just going to be harder to stick around. So.
Yeah, there wasn't anything flagrant like, why did the Steelers just do that type of move? So, but I have the same two as you as well. And because I think that they are at least solid players in their respective roles.
They're rosterable players for sure.
Yeah, I think Gentry for sure is a rosterable player. He should be able to land back on his feet somewhere else, I would think. Kind of in that Jesse James mold, a different player, but in that level where it's like you're good enough to land somewhere else again. So I hope that he does there. We knew that based on the additions Steelers already had, Muse was not going to be a starter. He wasn't even going to have a big role on defense. But I thought, historically speaking, the Steelers keep that fifth guy for special teams. I thought more or less he would be that new Marcus Allen, that guy that plays a ton of special team snaps. He was pretty good there for Seattle last year. And he's just an athletic guy that can run. And I just don't know if maybe he didn't fit like the mold that Tomlin was looking for at the linebacker position in terms of toughness. Like there's been questions in the past about his toughness. So maybe that's had something to do with it. But if they were snubs, I don't know if I'd call them snubs maybe, but those would be the two guys. Let's talk about who should have been cut. Is there anybody on the roster that made it this year who should have been cut instead?
I think
deserve to be cut.
Right. I think that the two you can argue for sure is James Pierre one, just because again, he's not like a spectacular special teamer necessarily. He's good at special teams, but he has just really struggled in the preseason in general. Just has kind of been a liability in coverage past, like we said, 10, 15 yards. It gets pretty ugly. So there's that. And then you also could argue realistically that Gunnar Olszewski, because of the fact that he's not really going to be the player that we expected him to be when we signed him. He's not going to be the kick and punt returner. He's not going to be the special teams ace necessarily. We have other guys who are better at those things than him. Like his role is just kind of up in the air. Like if he's just going to be strictly just like a true backup at a couple spots, and that's valuable to a certain degree. But I think that if they had someone else who could really challenge him, it'd be different. But the receiving group didn't really inspire a lot of confidence past the top six. So there's that.
Yeah, and I think that, James Pierre is the easy one here. I just don't think he had a very good summer at all. Yeah. And so he might not be, we'll see what happens here in the coming week or so after that. If he makes it, even to start the season, his spot, he's low enough that his spot is not going to be secure for sure. Right. So James Pierre was the easy one there. Then you can even look at a guy like Dylan Cook, maybe a guy that had a pretty strong camp, but we've seen kind of that stuff from players before that they haven't kept. Like they just roll with like 3 offensive tackles and or they go out and sign a different offensive lineman, the John LeGlue or whatever. And so I didn't necessarily think that he was a guy who needed to make this roster, but good for him that he did. Yeah. And I hope that he can just continue to develop and be kind of just another piece for them there. All right. Why did they keep 2 punters, Shayne? The question was floating out there, and it was a worthwhile question. And I, like other people, thought that the reason why was potentially maybe another trade was coming. We thought that, yes, Mann has starting experience in the past. He was pretty good the previous year. The Steelers had 2 somewhat quality punters, whereas other teams, they're like shuffling and scrambling around.
Yeah.
Maybe the Steelers, maybe based on what we've seen and already being able to get draft capital for Kendrick Green, maybe you can go and swap Mann for a conditional 7th round pick or something that way. It turned out that they just got to keep somebody else somewhere. Why not Mann? And he was ultimately the guy that they would swap off the roster for Desmond King. So that is put to rest now. And which positions, Shayne, would you still look to upgrade for the Steelers if you were the GM right now?
I think you look at boundary corners still, because again, Pierre's a guy that very easily could have been cut, and I think eventually probably will be in some, whether it's a swap like we talked about before, or just a straight cut and you add somewhere else. I think linebacker, backup linebacker again, because again, you really only have Robinson as the primary backup, like past the top 3 guys who are expected to play a lot of snaps. So you wonder if you do want to add a 5th linebacker at some point, like they typically do. Maybe backup running back again if they don't want McFarland to be the guy long term at the 3rd running back spot, which I think he played well enough to justify it offensively. It's just, again, is kick returning enough to keep your roster spot if you're not getting a lot of carries on offense? So those would be the ones I'd look at the most, just because everywhere else it feels like they're pretty happy with the depth at the very least, or to upgrade it, you'd have to like actually go and get a player who isn't just going to be readily available. You know what I mean? So
yeah,
we'll see if they want to make any moves past that, but that would be the 2 spots I would look at the most.
Yeah, certainly prior to the Des King move, it would have been slot cornerback, right?
Oh, like there was now that they have
you're not real comfortable with Shannon Sullivan and Elijah Riley there, so that's kind of been shored up. I would say backup center, Shayne, like a true backup center type. Like if you're not super comfortable with your game plan, if one of those guys were to go down, like is it Nate Herbig? You're probably not swapping things around. So if they can get like a true backup center type to essentially fill that role, and then unfortunately, I mean, you can't roll with 10 offensive linemen. So Cook probably goes back to
move. Yeah.
And I think that would probably be Cook going back to the practice squad at that point, if I had to guess.
Right.
But I think that's something they could explore for sure, is a true backup center, unless they do feel comfortable with Herbig in that role, or a shuffle of the offensive line. So that would be it. And then
good.
You're good. Go ahead.
I feel like that would happen, especially if Mason Cole goes down and they try their different combinations and it doesn't really work right. Yeah. That would be when I'd say, okay, maybe they're going to look at the market and see if there's somebody that they can bring in to play center. But yeah.
Yep. And then I agree with you. The only other one that I was going to point out was boundary cornerback. James Pierre just not really fitting the mold with what they need there in a pinch, at least. Probably serviceable enough still as a special teams player. But I think that were some opportunities there. I think that he's one of those guys. It's like, man, if Corey Trice had not gotten injured, you would have been out of a job.
Yeah, so, pretty sure.
He's the biggest beneficiary of that, I would have to think. Other than that, I think the roster's shaping up to be pretty good here, Shayne, as we start looking forward to week 1 now. We got the San Francisco 49ers, not this Sunday, but the Sunday afterwards. And so we're going to be pumped to bring you that game coverage. Make sure you're following us at Still Curtain. Thank you for joining us on the show today. You can follow Shayne on Twitter at Shayne Kubas. You can follow me on Twitter at Tommy Jaggi. You can download the Still Curtain podcast wherever you get your podcast. Also check us out on YouTube, or ask Alexa to play the Still Curtain podcast. And thanks for listening to the Still Curtain podcast.